Hello, I'm Jennifer Coffey from the Office of Special Education Programs in the U.S. Department of Education. Welcome to this informational webinar for potential applicants to the State Personnel Development Grants Program, also known as the SPDG or the SPDG, and that is CFDA 84.323A, and this is for fiscal year 2022. Wanted to make a note regarding this webinar that this provides you some guidance, but it is just a short webinar. And so it's very important that you read the entire notice inviting applications. In addition to that, the notice of final priority is an important document to read through. Also note, I am always available for questions. So as you're thinking of questions during this webinar, please do jot them down. And then you can email me, we can set up a conversation, or you can email me your question. I can answer it that way. It's dependent on how complicated the question is, really. I also would advise you to view the recorded webinar titled Applying for Office of Special Education Programs Discretionary Grants. That gives you more information on submitting an application, especially if you don't do it on a regular basis. It's nice to be reminded of the process so that that doesn't become an issue. All right, today's topic. So I'm going to talk about the purpose of the SPDG program, some assistance for developing your plan. Again, this is guidance. We have peer reviewers who make the decisions about this application, your application. I am not involved in that, so all I can do is give you guidance about what we've seen in previous years and what, as the program lead for the State Personnel Development Grant, some things I've seen that have worked better for people. And I'm going to talk about the absolute priorities as well as the competitive preference priority. Talk a little bit about definitions, the requirements around contracts, and then I'm going to talk about the Government Performance Results Act program, also known as program measures, the general requirements, and then finally the selection criteria. So the purpose of this SPDG is, it's authorized under IDEA, and it really hasn't changed a whole lot since 2004 when the statute first was put in place by Congress. So it's to reform and improve systems for personnel preparation and professional development and early intervention, educational and transition services in order to improve results for children with disabilities. I bolded those last words myself, because it is so important to remember why these grants are done. These are discretionary grants. Their sole purpose is to improve results for children with disabilities. So please do keep that in mind. Also embedded in this little statement is that state educational agencies are the only eligible applicant for this grant program. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, informational webinars don't take the place of reading the entire application package and the notice of final priority. I'm going to highlight certain things, but I'm not going to go over all of it because that would definitely take more than 45 minutes to an hour. It's a peer-reviewed competition, as I said, so I'm just going to give you some tips that will hopefully be helpful to you. And then also, just to note, if you are an SEA, State Educational Agency, and you're receiving new SPDG money in fiscal year 2022, you cannot apply for this grant. This is only for those states that are either in a no-cost extension or do not have a SPDG grant currently. Again, only eligible applicants are the state educational agencies. For example, they can't apply this year, but the Colorado Department of Education, they are a state educational agency. I did want to also note that NASD, the National Association of State Directors of Special Education, partnered with us to record a series of webinars on topics that we thought might be helpful to applicants. They are an hour each, and you'll see right here on the page that when you look at your PowerPoint slides, you'll get a link right to this page. But you see at the top, the purpose, all the different webinars, recorded webinars you can select from. And this is the table of contents that shows you which topics are there. So active implementation frameworks. This is about implementation science. There's also an overview of evidence-based professional development. So I recorded that, and it is about the professional development requirements for this grant. So that's something pretty important to think about as you're writing your application, is what your professional development system must include, the requirements that you have to take into consideration. And then we broke down some of those components of the evidence-based professional development rubric that we've created. And so Ebpd for short. Selection. This is selecting not just your trainers and coaches, but also your participants for professional development and others. And there were some handouts in that session. So if you go to that session, you'll see the handouts. We also had a great data systems presentation recording from Georgia. Talked about coaching, and that was from CSEP, I believe, State Implementation Scaling Up of Evidence-Based Practices TA Center, shared with us also about training, and within training, what does effective teacher professional development look like, or educator personnel professional development. And then there's also an observation checklist that's free to the public called the High Quality Professional Development Observation Checklist, and that's something to check out, from Amy Gummer Erickson and Patty Noonan and others. And then we talked about administrative facilitation and systems interventions. And to put that a little bit more simply, thinking about how administrators can support your work and how you can support them so that they can support your work, and also systems intervention. So these are things like, thinking through a school, a district, an early childhood program, the state system, what needs to change in the system to support what you want to do. So asking those questions, taking feedback, getting the data, and making changes as you go along. From there, we talked about improving implementation fidelity, which can be quite challenging. We've seen it happen more and more with the SPDG grants, but you're looking at how you provide professional development, how do you do your training, your coaching, etc. And then what effect does that have on the personnel you're working with? Say you're working with speech and language therapists, or school psychologists, or special education teachers, or general education teachers. How do you improve their ability to use your intervention? And that's about the fidelity. And so everything you're doing, all those implementation supports that you are putting to practice to improve personnel fidelity. And then increasing coherence in your data system. So how does one data system talk to another? How do you think of all the levels of your state education system? Aligning with other statewide initiatives and federal programs. We know there are ESSER funds. We know there are other initiatives at the state level. We know there might be MTSS going on. There might be social emotional learning. How is it all going to work together? It's part of what you need to look at and share in your application. And then sustaining coaching, it is something that sometimes, as important as we know it is, it can sometimes be dropped because there aren't enough people, there's not enough time. So how do you think about efficiencies? How can you do it more efficiently? Is peer coaching an opportunity? Can you put into play some coaching functions for people who are already there? That's one thought. Training up local coaches is another way to sustain coaches. So we got a little more in depth than that in that presentation. And then learning in a community. So how do you bring in stakeholders, not just in your application process, but also as you do your work? How are families involved in what you're putting into your application and how you implement your initiative? How are administrators involved? What are the other voices you need to bring in from the community? One example that I don't think I have in the slides, but I just wanted to share is the Idaho SPDG. They currently have a grant that is about literacy, and they're working with their state library system, which is fantastic because you have access to families that way, something that is already available to you. So very sustainable because it's going to be there for a while, your state library system. Have you thought about working with barbershops, working with churches, working with other community organizations? Really be thinking about who else can help you spread these practices and sustain the practices that you're most interested in. Although a logic model is not required for your application, we do recommend that you create a logic model for your project. It's really going to help you think out your project services, your evaluation plan. It all connects together, and we have many evaluation resources to help you do that work. And so here at OSEP Ideas That Work, you'll see some of our evaluation resources, all free, all available to you. Just click that little link. Compared to what? So how can you have comparison data in your evaluation of your SPDG? What can you compare to? We know if you're looking at data and you see this is how a state's doing, you think, oh, that's really interesting. If you say this is how a state's doing compared to all the other states, it gets much more interesting and much more useful. You can say the same about districts, early childhood programs, schools. How are they doing in comparison, or one classroom to another, or the students compared to another? So that thinking through those possible comparisons. Linking expectations to evaluations. This is all about using your logic model to create your evaluation plan, which is a fantastic support for you in this time of putting your application together. Making project measures meaningful. So you get to talk about the kinds of project measures you're going to have in your application, and that's going to tell your story of whether or not you've achieved your objectives, right? What will look different in your state as a result of your work, and how will you know that? What is a meaningful evaluation measure or measures for you? Hiring a third-party evaluator. So having an external evaluator, how are you determining who you're going to work with? You might take a glance at that now, get some ideas of the percentage of your annual budget you would want to spend on that, how you would want to work with them. If an external evaluator supports you in your application, you may, just to note that you may have them in the personnel. We know that each state then has to go through a contracting process. So we're aware that you can't always use exactly the person that you have named in your application. Managing evaluation data might be helpful later on. Project performance measurement. This is an entire grantee guide, which I think would be terrific for applicants. There's some templates. There's a webinar. If you like getting your information that way, rather than reading through the whole guide, you might want to start there. Communicating evaluation findings. Again, this might be once you actually get started with your SPDG, that's really important, and how you share in your state within the education system or the early childhood system. There's a resource toolkit on evaluation, demonstrating evidence across a project cycle. So thinking throughout your 5 years of your project, what that would look like. There's a logic model outline that you could borrow from here. It's not stealing because it's free. Budgeting for evaluation, that might help you with planning out your budget. Capacity building, what does that look like to measure capacity building? And CSEP, who I'd mentioned earlier, that Implementation Science Center, also has some good a district capacity assessment, a state capacity assessment, measures for the building level. And then why evaluate? I think this group who would be watching this informational webinar knows why they would evaluate. All right, so there are 3 priorities in the current notice. There are 2 absolute priorities and 1 competitive preference priority. So absolute priority 1 was first published in 2012. And that is about how you do your work, your evidence-based professional development using technology. I'll talk about a little bit more. Absolute priority 2 is from IDEA statute, so 651 to 655. And that talks about putting together your professional development plan, looking across your state to determine what else is occurring and how your project is going to fit in with those, or not if it's not appropriate, but you should be understanding your state system and how everything is working together. And then the competitive preference priority is from this notice of final priority that came out with the notice inviting application. So you'd seen the notice of proposed priority. This is now the final priority, and that's about comprehensive systems of personnel development in early childhood. So whether or not you decide to respond to the competitive preference priority is up to you. You still must respond to absolute priority 1 and 2. So absolute priority 1, I talked about, it's how you do your work. So use evidence-based professional development practices that will increase implementation of evidence-based practices and result in improved outcomes for children with disabilities. I'm going to take that apart a little bit. So this is how you do your professional development, your training, your coaching. I talked about selection, data systems, that kind of thing. And then it talks about you doing all that to support implementation of evidence-based practices, such as like literacy interventions, secondary transition, supporting students to be included in the general curriculum. Those are all the initiatives or interventions that you're going to be supporting with your implementation practices. You also need to provide ongoing assistance. So this is about coaching, mentoring, helping groups use data, perhaps having professional learning communities and supporting those. Can look a lot of different ways, but ongoing assistance is what happens after initial training. So you think about the skills you want people to have, you have training to develop those skills, and then you have the ongoing assistance that supports the use of those skills in an ongoing way and continues to improve the use of those skills. Using technology to more efficiently and effectively provide ongoing professional development. So how is technology going to be used? We've seen examples such as like the swivel robots in classrooms that can help with virtual coaching. So virtual being somebody is coaching, we used to call it bug and ear, but it's, or e-coaching. So it's, the coach is not on the ground, but they can see what's happening on site, and they can give feedback on that. So could you use technology that way? Are you thinking about having micro credentials, which could use internet-based modules? Many ways to use technology. You just need to consider what works best for you. Absolute priority 2, this is about your state personnel development plan. This part is a little bit confusing, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. But again, it's looking at your state system of personal preparation and professional development, so pre-service and in-service, and individuals who provide direct supplementary aids and services to children with disabilities. What is happening in your state? What are the needs that remain? And how can this SPDG fill that? And you're going to be describing that in your application. All right, so breaking down the competitive preference priority that is new this year. It's called Supporting an IDEA Part C Comprehensive System of Personnel Development. You may receive 0 or 3 points if you write to this. So there's no 1 or 2 points. There's just either you are not responding appropriately to the priority as determined by the peer reviewers, or you do respond to the priority and you are given the 3 points. Again, this is optional for you to respond to. A competitive preference priority is optional in this case. So the purpose of the priority is to fund projects that will enable the state to meet the CSPD, which is Comprehensive System of Personnel Development, requirements that are stated in sections 635A8 and 9 of IDEA. So those are listed in the notice of final priority, and there's also information in the notice inviting applicants. So please do take a look at that. Again, this webinar doesn't take the place of really reading and understanding it, but I want to give you a little bit of a perspective before you do that, or perhaps you've already read it and this comes after, but hopefully it's helpful to you to amplify some of the ideas. So if you're SEA, say again, you're the Colorado Department of Education, which you wouldn't be this year because they're not applying this year. But if you were the Colorado Department of Education and you don't have the lead agency for IDEA Part C as part of the SEA, say it's in Human Services, then you must establish a partnership consistent with IDEA Section 652B1B with that state lead agency responsible for administering IDEA Part C. And you have to work together to ensure there's enough of a budget to support further development of the comprehensive system of personnel development. So you're going to work through the budget, you're going to work through the activities together, you're going to work for what that partnership is going to look like, how money is going to flow from the SEA to the lead agency, and work out all those things together. If the lead agency is part of the SEA, it's a much different conversation, but we at the Department of Education thought it might be more challenging and therefore wanted to provide a little bit more background and description for those SEAs that do not have the lead agency as part of their agency. I want to go through a few terms that we've defined in the notices. Personnel, this is a very broad term under IDEA. So we're not just talking about teachers. And we're not just talking about special education teachers. We're talking about special education teachers, regular education teachers, principals, other administrators, related services personnel, paraprofessionals, early intervention personnel serving infants, toddlers, preschoolers, or children with disabilities. And so that's the big idea here, that it is a very broad scope of people you are able to support with your SPDG work, all to improve results for children with disabilities. Fidelity means delivery of instruction or an intervention in the way in which it was designed to be delivered. So there are additional SPDG requirements, and so you need to have this included in your budget for each year of your grant, for your up to 5-year grant, and most applicants do ask for 5 years. So there's a 3-day project directors meeting in Washington, D.C. that's been virtual recently, but we're hoping next year to go back in person. So budgeting for that DC trip and stay, you can bring as many people from your project as you would like, but the project director is required to be there. Budgeting $4,000 annually to support the website and the SPDG national meeting and the monthly webinars and the communities of practice that the SIG network, the State Improvement Grant Network, it used to be, so it's called SIG Network, supports out of the University of Oregon. So $4,000 annually for the entirety of your project. And if you have a website, if you plan to have a website, you need to document that it's going to be accessible by a government or industry recognized standard. Now, this is a requirement for the contracts and subgrants. Again, there are sections of this notice that are confusing, of the notice inviting applicants in the application package. They're going to be a little bit confusing. So I want to clarify the contracts that are required. So you must award contracts or subgrants to LEAs, IHEs, parent training and information centers, or community parent resource centers. So the reason there's an or there is that every year of your grant, you must have a contract or subgrant in place with an OSEP funded parent center in your state. So either the PTI, Parent Training and Information Center, or the Community Parent Resource Center, if you have one, are fine. You can have both. You can have, as well as at the PTI, you could have all the family engagement groups you want to be part of your grant, but you must have at least one OSEP funded parent center from your state that you're contracting or subgranting to. You also must have one local educational agency and one institute of higher education. You may award other contracts and subgrants to other public and private entities, including the lead agency under Part C of IDEA, to carry out the state plan. So again, you've got the floor of what you must do, and then you've got all the other partners that you want to have in place. Funds for professional development. So under this grant, you must use at least 90% of your funds for professional development activities, and they're described in paragraph A. So again, it's that training, that coaching. What are you going to do to support the initiative or initiatives that you describe in your application, these evidence-based practices? And then not more than 10% of funds can be used for activities described in paragraph B. So there's this other use of funds section, and those can be things that are more systems change that support your professional development. It can look a little different. Please do look through the menu of options to determine what makes the most sense. You might be looking at changing credentialing. There's some great options there, but you're going to need to look at that menu and determine what makes the most sense. The Government Performance Results Act performance measures. As I said before, we sometimes call them the program measures because you as a program are going to collect this information, and then we aggregate across the program, all the states, to provide the GEPRA is what we call them, measures that we then give to Congress to say this is how our program is doing. So there are 5 measures. There is first the professional development practices. This is about that evidence-based professional development rubric that we have available to you to take a look at on our website. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and show that to you right now. So if you go to signetwork.org, and then from there you go to program measures, you'll see there's information about the annual performance report, but you'll see there's the program measures for the SPDGs. And from there, we have the Ebpd worksheet and rubric. So the rubric is what you want. You open that up. And this is the description of the different components of evidence-based professional development that the SPDG is based on and that GEPRA measure is based on. So I talked earlier about selection. So you can see here clear expectations are provided for PD participants and for schools, districts, or other entities. It could be early childhood programs. And then it talks about what would an exemplary level of progress look like. So this is just an example of what you could be including as you're doing your work. So I think the important thing here is to think about these expectations and required elements. These are going to be things you need to do with your project. So what can you describe in your application about how you're going to do that work? And then from selection, you're going to go down to training as the second domain. And then from training, we have more training and thinking about adult learning practices, thinking about the skills, how you're going to measure participants' gain in skills as a result of the training. And how you know the trainers are doing what you want them to do. How do you know they're training with Fidelity? So there's some questions related to that. And then from there, we go into coaching. So who's going to be responsible for coaching? How do you know that how are they going to know it's timely, it's being done the way it should be done? Using effective coaching practices. There's a great coaching practice profile from CSEP that talks about the core components of coaching or the key features of coaching. And then coaching outcome data. How do you know if the coaching is working? So if you're thinking about, what you're doing in training and the impact it's having, the impact that coaching is having, and then what's happening with personnel fidelity, what's happening with their fidelity of the new practices they're learning. And then from there, how does that connect with the child outcomes? That's the big idea. And then this is data systems and support for decision-making. There's about coherent data systems, how participants in professional development know how to provide you with data, kind of data you're collecting, fidelity data, student outcomes, continuous improvement, sharing those data across the state education system or early childhood system. Systemic leadership supports. So who's accountable for the technical and adaptive leadership at the state level for the project? So you got your state management team, perhaps, or a state leadership team. How are they going to look at the data? What's the feedback loop going to look like with the other parts of the state system so that they can make decisions that are needed by the project? And then the leadership systems being in place to build state level capacity and promote project sustainability. So in the end, what has changed in the state system capacity wise as a result of your work, and how are you going to get there? So that is the Ebpd rubric, evidence-based professional development rubric. Go back to our slide. There. So that's that first program measure. Projects use professional development practices supported by evidence. And then the second one is about improving implementation. So again, that big idea of you provide good professional development. As a result, educators, early childhood providers are able to use those practices with fidelity. And then from there, the third program measure is about how you use your funds to sustain, further implementation and sustain the use of those SPDG supported practices. So after initial training, how are you doing coaching or mentoring? How are you collecting data and using those data to continuously improve? And then the fourth, actually, I'm going to drop that fourth one. The special education teacher retention is no longer a required measure, although you can have it as a project measure. So the final measure is about improving outcomes for children with disabilities. So you get to create your own outcome measure for your work. What makes sense? What would change as a result of your work for children with disabilities? And having a plan to connect the professional development with the fidelity, with the child outcomes is the big idea. Again, here are some links to what I just talked about. So you're just going to link through. I showed you how to get there, but also you can just use this link to get to the Ebpd rubrics. And there are other materials available to help you plan for gathering those GEPRA data or those program measures. And then there's some help from CSEP. I had mentioned that they have some good tools for coaching, but they also have good tools for implementation fidelity. You don't already have a fidelity measure and there's not one available, publicly available, there's some information about how you could create one, although we highly recommend using something that is already created because it is not an easy job. Planning and budgeting, please do describe the potential sites you plan to work with, give the reviewers a good picture of what your work is going to look like in the day-to-day. You want to really give them an image in your head. We know that systems are in flux currently. So again, the fact that you put in your application doesn't mean you're absolutely required to do work with those sites and those people. You will work on your contracts, you'll work on your agreements once you get your grant, but giving an image and knowing that there are some groups that want to work with you, I think is important. You'll work with your project officer on that if you are funded. You can request a lower level of funding for your first year of your project and then ramp up your activities as sites are ready, as you as the state are ready. You don't want to take too long to get going. And if you can get going right away, that's great. But if you need that year to get things rolling, that first year to get things rolling a bit, and you're not ready to just out of the gate start all your implementation activities, you may ask for less money that first year. So some more general requirements. You must make positive efforts to employ and advance in employment qualified individuals with disabilities. And please do describe how you'll do that in your application. You must involve individuals with disabilities or parents of individuals with disabilities aged birth through 26 in the planning, implementation, and evaluation of the project. So please describe how you're going to do that. OSEP has expectations for how our grantees will engage families in their work. And I wanted to give you some highlights from that. We do expect our grantees to engage family members to fully participate in planning, implementing, and evaluating the project. And I generally give the advice that you want to try to go beyond the family members who are regularly working with the state to get other, it doesn't mean that you can't involve them, but you want other perspectives as well, people who are not regularly working with you. And that could be at the district level, the early childhood program, the building level, but be thinking of all the different levels and the great feedback that you could be getting and input you could be getting. Thinking through your training, technical assistance, and coaching to families and to project staff and how they engage families. How are you going to make that equitable? How are you going to make sure there is sufficient training and coaching, technical assistance to those groups? Financial resources. If families are involved in any way, they should be receiving honoraria and stipends for childcare and travel. Thinking about how they can actively participate in things and then having the financial resources to do so. Recruiting family members for positions on your project and thinking about non-traditional recruitment and networking strategies. Family perspective and experiences. How are you going to have them as part of the project operations? And one thing that is not on here, but I would love for folks to consider is how you bring that perspective can really be integrated into your IHE work as well as your in-service work. And so families as faculty, where you have families as instructors for classes of personnel who are being prepared, is a great way to do that. You can also have it in service. You can have family visits. You can have other experiences for people in service. But be innovative and look what other states are doing. How can you make that real? Also, student-led IEPs are a great way to engage families. And I honestly don't see that done quite enough. That second bullet, effectively engaging families requires projects to clearly plan for how they will engage families, building trusting and respectful partnerships, and identifying the expected outcomes of the collaboration. Too often, I do not see project measures related to how families are being engaged. What do you want to accomplish, and how will you know in your evaluation? How will you know you're reaching those objectives? Incorporating current research about family engagement. And then capacity building, thinking through that, using adult learning principles and coaches when it comes to families. A continuum of support, thinking through how you can be culturally competent or culturally responsive or culturally humble might be even better, and provide trauma-informed supports. And then thinking about intensive ongoing work and maintaining partnerships, and how those partnerships can increase your efficiency and effectiveness as a project. Our estimated available funds are over $21 million. You can see $21,666,000. And we estimate the range of awards will be from $500,000 to $2.1 million. The $4 million is actually the largest amount any state could ask for. But typically we haven't gone beyond 2.1 million for this. Please do look at the numbers we have in the notice of what states received last time. Think about the population of your state and what might be appropriate to ask for. In the case of outlying areas such as US Virgin Islands, American Samoas, Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, the award cannot be less than 80,000. For all other states, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, cannot be less than 500,000 per year, I should say. We do consider, when it comes to the amount of funding, we do consider, again, the population of your state, the amount of funds we have for making the grants, the type of activities you propose and matching the budget to that, how you proposed activities align with IDEA, and how they match up with the state plans under ESEA, and also the research and instruction that you have listed there. You know, what's the evidence? What's the research that backs up what you're going to do, which helps us know if it's going to be effective. Note that the format and page limit are recommendations now. They are no longer requirements. That said, do be very thoughtful in using extra pages beyond the recommendations. Peer reviewers are going to have expectations that you stay close to that at the very least. And as I always say, you do not want a grumpy reviewer. Appendices. So please do read very carefully the directions about appendices. You want to make sure all your information gets the peer reviewers and where things are supposed to be. So read that very closely. And also read about the narrative formatting. I've talked about this a little bit. So these are the selection criteria. So this is how the peer reviewers are going to rate each of the applications. You'll note that the highest number of points are in the project design and the quality of project evaluation, next highest in significance and adequacy of resources and quality of the management plan, and then personnel. So the significance, you need to be making a good statement about understanding the gaps and weaknesses in services, infrastructure, or opportunities in your state, and how you're going to address them, and giving a real sense of why it's necessary to, that rationale to addressing them. And then describing your training and other professional development services. We talked about coaching, how they're going to be of sufficient quality, intensity, and duration. So how will the training and coaching, et cetera, be enough to lead to improvements in practice? We talked about that implementation fidelity for personnel. And also, what's the likelihood that your project is going to make a big change in your state system, in the educational or early childhood system in your state? For quality of project design, this is about your goals, objectives, and outcomes. Are they specified? Are they measurable? Again, are you giving the reviewers a real good image of what you're going to accomplish and how? Will you address the needs of the target population? Do you describe the needs of the target population and other identified needs that you're going to respond to, and give them a good sense of how you're going to respond to those needs? And thinking, describing the collaboration with appropriate partners and how that's going to maximize your effectiveness of project services. We talked about the example of the library system, thinking innovatively about who you can partner with. And this is still project design and reflecting up-to-date knowledge. We talked about that a little bit with family engagement. So as recent as possible, as seminal as possible, the research on the practices that you're choosing. And linkages with other appropriate agencies and organizations. Again, this is definitely part of working with early childhood, but it could be Voc Rehab, could be other groups. How are you going to establish those linkages to serve the target population? This is project personnel. So thinking about or describing how you encourage applications for employment from people who are members of groups that have traditionally been underrepresented based on race, color, national origin, gender, age, or disability. And then the qualifications of all your key personnel. What's their relevant training and experience? Why will they be able to do those roles effectively? And then this is your partners, demonstrating their commitment and how they're relevant to you reaching your objectives. Describing an adequate budget. Again, you should have a good sense of what your activities are and how the budget will support that. Please make sure there's sufficient budget to support all your partners. And specifically for that family engagement work, we sometimes see a budget that is not sufficient. And then the management plan, are you going to be able to meet your objectives on time and within budget? And do you have clearly defined responsibilities, timelines, and milestones for accomplishing your project tasks? This is about the quality of the quality of the management plan and adequacy of resources. How will you ensure that a diversity of perspectives are brought to bear in the operation of your project, including parents, teachers, business community, in a variety of disciplinary and professional fields, recipients or beneficiaries of the services, or others as appropriate? And what's the potential for continued support? What's the potential for sustainability? How are you going to describe that in your application? And that includes having this commitment of appropriate partners. In the project evaluation, I've made this very simple. Methods of evaluation are thorough, feasible, and appropriate to the goals, objectives, and outcomes of the proposed project. We talked about logic model. We talked about good performance measures. We talked about family engagement, should have a measure related to it. So I've said various things about evaluation throughout this webinar. Creating a good evaluation plan based on a logic model that demonstrates how you'll know you've made a difference in the system and on the ground and with families and with the personnel. It's big. It might just be one sentence here, but it's a big undertaking, which is why it's 25 points. Again, please do contact me anytime. I think the easiest thing is to email me and then we can set up a time to talk. We can have a Teams meeting or like Zoom, but Teams meeting anytime. I am available to you and would love to hear your questions. If it's about grants.gov specifically, please do email or call grants.gov. We project officers don't have the ability to support you in that. There's also a grants.gov training that you'll see the link to here. So thank you so much for getting through this entire informational webinar. I look forward to hearing any questions you have. Again, just read very carefully through the application package and ensure that you understand how to where, you know, the table of contents, where everything goes, where in the appendices they go, that you're up on grants.gov, that you are ready to apply, and that you don't apply at the last minute, because I have seen things go wrong in that instance. That there is a very strict deadline, and anything we receive after that, the reviewers don't look at. So please be ready ahead of time. Don't do it on the last day if at all possible. But I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you so much.